Let's talk about who wrote the Pledge of Allegiance. Well, this video is going to require a lot of explanation, so let's get to it. There's a legend that the people of Cherryvale, Kansas, or at least a good portion of Cherryvale, Kansas, have been promoting for quite some time that one of their hometown boys from many years ago was the actual author of the Pledge of Allegiance. So let's review a few things about the history of the Pledge of Allegiance. It was first published in September 1892 in a magazine called The Youth's Companion. The pledge was published as part of a program by the magazine to promote patriotism in the public schools in conjunction with the 400th anniversary of Columbus discovering America. The pledge was a little shorter than it is now. It has had some modifications over the years. Also, it was first published anonymously in the Youth's Companion. However, several decades later, it was accredited to Frank Bellamy, an employee of the magazine at the time of the publication. Here are some brief details about Frank Bellamy of New York. He was a Baptist minister prior to working for the Youth's Companion. A lot of people, historians, seem to want to make a big deal out of that for some reason. Maybe it's because the pledge didn't originally include the words "under God." He attended the University of Rochester in New York and is known as the university's most quoted graduate. He reportedly wrote the Pledge of Allegiance in August 1892 in the office of the Youth Companion shortly before it was published. I believe the building that formerly housed the Youth's Companion offices is now known as the Pledge of Allegiance building, and he is buried in Rome, New York. So now that we've heard the account of who wrote the pledge and how it was written that is accepted by historians, let's get into this alternate theory put forth by some Cherryvale citizens. The best source for outlining this theory, I don't know that it's the best book I've ever read by any stretch, but it is probably the best source of information about the alternative theory from Cherryvale, is in the book Be the Jury, Be the Judge, Who Wrote the Pledge of Allegiance by Cherryvale resident Joyce Long. If you choose to read it yourself, you can get it on your Kindle through Amazon. The Cherryvale theory is that the Pledge of Allegiance was written by a local boy named Frank Bellamy. Yes, he has a nearly identical name to the Frank Bellamy who worked for the Youth's Companion. No explanation has been given for this coincidence. That is part of the mystery, I guess. For the purposes of the video, you may hear me from time to time refer to Frank Bellamy as the Kansas Bellamy and Frank Bellamy from New York as the New York Bellamy. So here are some brief details about Frank Bellamy of Cherryvale and what had allegedly happened. The Kansas Bellamy was born in September 1876 in Madison, Indiana. His family moved to Kansas, eventually settling in Cherryvale, where he attended the public schools. He was a high school student in Cherryvale at the time the Pledge of Allegiance was published. He later fought in the Spanish-American War. He contracted tuberculosis, apparently as part of his service in the war during the Philippine insurrection, and he moved to Denver, Colorado. He died in 1915 in Denver, Colorado, but was buried in Cherryvale, Kansas. Continuing on, this Frank Bellamy of Kansas allegedly entered an essay contest for the Youth's Companion in 1890. His essay included the Pledge of Allegiance. 2 years later, the pledge was published without the people at the Youth's Companion ever acknowledging who he wrote it. He apparently wrote the magazine a letter asking them about this. Their only response was that all entries in the contest became the property of the magazine. People who knew him allegedly saw him write and recite the pledge, although throw in my 2 cents that most of these accounts took place after 1892, when it had already been published. This included some of his fellow soldiers in the Army, and decades later, after his death, a committee set up to determine who wrote the Pledge of Allegiance ignored this account entirely and determined that Francis Bellamy of New York, who had claimed authorship later in life, was the author of the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, I do think it is true, whether you believe the Cherryvale legend or not, that this committee did pretty much ignore this account altogether. So, what are some problems with the account that Frank Bellamy of Kansas wrote the pledge? Well, I think one issue, I don't know if it's a problem, but one thing you have to accept is if you want to believe this account, then you sort of believe that he submitted his essay to the magazine. They did nothing with it but store it somewhere for 2.5 years. And then when they were struggling to come up with ideas for something to say for their program, they dug it out of a file somewhere and used it. That's a bit of a stretch for me personally. Now, some people, including Joyce Long, the author of that book I mentioned, may find the Francis Bellamy of New York's account a little suspicious, that he wrote this on a hot August night and emerged from his office saying, "I have it." I do know sometimes people who work in this industry do write things under incredibly tight deadlines. This would have been about a month before it was first published in the magazine. Got to remember, they were trying to find something that they could use for this program on Columbus Day 1892, which Columbus Day took place in October. So they had to get something written for a September publication. Now, the Kansas Bellamy supporters would probably like to point out that none of these claims about Francis Bellamy writing it, the Francis Bellamy of New York, came about till after Frank Bellamy had already passed away. This account that Frank wrote the magazine asking about his entry, and they responded by saying, any entries become property of the magazine. That's not really an acknowledgement of the entry very much. It's more of a standard response that a lot of publications of that nature probably had. And we don't have a copy of any of the Kansas Bellamy's writings to determine what he actually wrote or said. This is all part of the story, I guess. Now, I have read the book by Joyce Long, which goes into much more detail than I'm going to be able to go into in this short video. Do I think she makes a convincing case that Frank Bellamy of Kansas wrote the Pledge of Allegiance? In my frankly, every point in the narrative about the Kansas Bellamy and the account of him allegedly writing the Pledge of Allegiance could be questioned with, according to who? According to what? He entered this essay contest in 1890. According to who? He claimed he wrote the pledge to people. He told people he wrote it. Well, that doesn't necessarily prove he wrote it. At best, it's probably evidence that he told people he wrote it. There's nothing in any of the accounts of people who knew him, who he said this to, about why he chose the words that he did. For instance, why did he choose the words "to the Republic"? Or why did he use the phrase "indivisible"? We know from some of the papers on file at the University of Rochester why Francis Bellamy chose some of these words. Now, the Cherryvale believers can point out that he had many years after the fact to come up with an explanation for everything, and yes, that's true. However, I'm just saying we have no accounts of why Frank Bellamy of Kansas allegedly used some of these words like he did. Now, the number one thing about this whole story out of Cherryvale that makes me think there could be some credence to it, and it's something I don't think Mrs. Long emphasized enough in her book, is the fact that this legend is not new. It has been circulated and known for years in the community and other places. In fact, in 1917, about 2 years after Frank Bellamy's death, the Kansas Bellamy's death, there was an article published in the Kansas City Star talking about how he wrote the Pledge of Allegiance. And I don't know why the author of the book, trying to prove the case that Frank Bellamy wrote it, wouldn't quote such an article almost verbatim so we could tell what it has to say. It could be that the articles written shortly after the Kansas Bellamy's death, like the one in the Kansas City Star, were wrong back then, and thus they're wrong now. But it would have been nice if Mrs. Long had included them in order to support her case. I suppose it's possible these articles didn't quote their sources very well or say how they got their information. They may have just been repeating a story, but Who knows? The Francis Bellamy of New York apparently didn't claim to have written the Pledge of Allegiance until the early 1920s, and by the time a group was formed years later to consider the authorship, I guess these articles about Frank Bellamy of Kansas were ignored. All things considered, I'm not convinced Frank Bellamy of Kansas wrote the Pledge of Allegiance, and I don't think Joyce Long makes a good enough argument that he did in her book. I don't think she presents enough evidence. That being said, there are a lot of unanswered questions about this legend. How did it originate? Why in the world do both of these people who allegedly wrote the Pledge of Allegiance have nearly the exact same name, even though they weren't related? And is there any yet to be uncovered physical evidence that might indicate Frank Bellamy wrote the pledge? For example, a previously unknown diary manuscript, or has it all been lost to the sands of time? It's been about 8 years since Joyce Long first published her book. This legend that Frank Bellamy of Cherryvale, Kansas, wrote the Pledge of Allegiance is not widely accepted outside Cherryvale or even Montgomery County, Kansas, where Cherryvale is located. This is an intriguing story. It kind of reminds me of those legends about old Wild West outlaws, that outlaws like Jesse James and Billy the Kid, for example, allegedly faking their deaths and then living out their lives under different names. Most of those legends have been disproven now through DNA testing, however. If the residents of Cherryvale who believe Frank Bellamy of Kansas wrote the Pledge of Allegiance want their story to become more widely considered and accepted, I think more research is necessary. Thank you for watching, and go ahead and comment on the video and let me know what you think. Bye.